Hello and welcome. My name is Federico Ast. I am president at the cooperative Kleros, and welcome to a new episode of the Decentralized Justice Broadcast. Our guest today is blockchain and law pioneer and superstar Primavera Di Filippi. Primavera is a French legal scholar, internet activist, and artist whose work focuses on blockchain, peer prediction, communities, and copyright law. She is a permanent researcher at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique and faculty associate at the Bergman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And she's author of the book Blockchain and the Law, published by Harvard University Press, which I very much recommend. I have been following Primavera and in connection with her for a long time now, and is a person I greatly admire. So welcome to our podcast, Primavera.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, let's get started. I typically ask all of our guests to tell us a bit of their early years. I mean, their story, how they started with their path, and so what motivated you to focus on law and technology, and how did you get into blockchain?
Yeah, I think so. I started with economics actually, and then I moved into law, mostly like copyright law, and looking at like what are the different challenges that the digital environment is actually bringing to copyright. And then this kind of like brought me to peer-to-peer file sharing and all those decentralized infrastructure. And then I realized that there are many others interesting legal challenges that online distributed networks creates. So I started looking mostly at this, decentralized file sharing, Tor, Freenet, and mesh networks and whatnot, like all the decentralization that is emerging on the internet. And then obviously then Bitcoin came about, and this is yet another interesting decentralized application that raises interesting legal challenges. And then Ethereum came out, and then that's, I think, when I decided that all of my research will actually focus on that.
No. Before getting into Ethereum, which we will discuss later, I mean, I would like to know what, I don't know, books, movies, or other materials were like influential for you in your formative years. I mean, yeah, what did you read? What were your interests?
So my whatever means the formative years,
Whatever you want
what
to
are
mean.
those years? I think I will say the internet, Wikipedia, or pre-Wikipedia. But yeah, I think the one thing that formed me the most to the culture, I guess, that I have today is pretty much discovering the internet and just navigating into the blue trails of hyperlinks, and mostly like connecting with like early online communities and so forth. And I was very much into like the open source and Creative Commons and this type of like digital activism for freedom of information. And then I slowly moved into the blockchain.
Okay. So yeah, now we can go back to Ethereum. So what were the so Ethereum, I think, was born in 2014. So how did you get to know about the project, and why did you become interested in it?
So we used to, like with my research project, we used to have this tradition that we would always do a little field trip after our meetings. And we had a meeting in Barcelona, and so we decided to do a field trip. And we identified this very interesting post-capitalist eco-industrial commune that was named Calafou, which was a few hours away from Barcelona. So we went to visit there because the research project was about exploring common-based governance online and offline. And we were very curious about the governance that was happening there. And interestingly enough, this happened to be the place in which Vitalik and the dark wallet team were staying at for a while. And so I met the dark wallet team, and they started telling me about the early visions, I guess, of Ethereum, and that Vitalik was envisioning at the time. And then they were telling me about smart contracts and DAOs, and I was like, "Whoa, what are they talking about?" And then I went home and I started googling about this, and I was like, "What? I don't fully understand what it is about, but if this thing is ever gonna happen, I want to be studying that." And I guess that's how I started digging the hole of Ethereum research.
This was like before the launch of Ethereum, right?
Yeah, I think it was like, I don't know, late 2013 or early 2014. I don't remember.
I mean, they were like writing the white paper, I mean, like that type of.
Yeah, I think it was really like when things were starting to be conceptualized.
Okay, interesting. And you said a word. I mean, I got, what do you mean by a post-capitalist community? I mean, yeah, new governance models.
Yeah. So I mean, there is many of them, I guess, now, but even then, what the value system of this community is exploring alternatives to capitalism and trying to design governance structures that can transcend the current logics of capitalism. And but the reason that I thought it was very interesting is that, as opposed to traditional eco-village, which are more about we need to stop technological innovation and progress because this is destroying the climate. This one was kind of this very interesting dual system in which there were like, there were like the electro lab, there was the biohack lab, and like, I don't know, Vitalik and Dark Wallet doing the blockchain stuff. So it was very ecological and like, self-reliance and sustainability and farming, while at the same time being very open to exploring technological advances and how technology can support this post-capitalist vision. So I mean, this is the superficial description because I only came and visited for a few hours. But I think that was what attracted us to go there, is that it's rare to find a place which has an intersection of both very, very pioneering technological exploration and very ecological, very anti-capitalist mindset as well.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, and so you go to this meeting. You know Ethereum. You know Vitalik, and how do you get involved in this movement? And what is your next step? I mean, you started researching blockchain and legal implications. You were a researcher back then already, right?
Yeah, I was a researcher already. Basically, I decided that this will be the main focus of my research. And at the time I was at CNRS, and literally no one really understood what I was talking about. And I was like, wow, no one in France understands this thing. So I started looking around on the internet, where are there academic institutions that are even looking at blockchain? And I found this tweet from Jonathan Zittrain, which still is the director of the Berkman Center. That was just, I don't know, he just made a tweet about Bitcoin, I guess. And I was like, okay, this is where I'm going. I guess they care about those topics there. So I just applied and I found myself at Harvard. And then it turns out that no one was really looking at blockchain at Harvard either. but but that's where I set up my new home. And I guess slowly, years over years, things change. And that's also when I created Koala, which was essentially driven from the fact that I felt a little bit lonely as like the one lawyer that is caring about blockchain technology. And then I was like, of course, there is many others. They're just like everywhere in the world. And so Koala was kind of like this early attempt at gathering together all those lawyers that understand blockchain technology or are interested in looking at it. And also those, at the time, those very few blockchain engineers or entrepreneurs that actually cared about legal issues and that wanted to understand how do we move forward and how do we create like bridges or how do we link the legal system and the blockchain systems. And yeah, so Koala was born out of loneliness and then I met up with Constance, and then we set up this whole network, and now it's now it's easy because now there is a lot of more and more people that actually do care about both of those question of law and blockchain.
Well, I mean, I can totally relate to your story because I kind of have the same. I mean, I was just a guy. It was around that time. It was in Argentina, and speaking on how blockchain could, I mean, transform dispute resolution and arbitration. Imagine how crazy I sounded. I mean, at least you were lucky enough to go to Harvard, where people at least they were, I guess, people were exploring new things. I mean, for me it was being in the middle of the desert, more or less. But the internet gives us the answers sometimes. I guess I got connected to you back then, maybe at some point that you were working. I think the name was a Blockstack project.
DAOstack?
DAOstack. Yeah, Blockstack is another one. DAOstack. Yeah, correct. What was this?
DAOstack. DAOstack is about creating infrastructure for DAO, facilitate DAOs governance and economic models. So the idea is that and many people are building different types of DAOs, and every time starting from scratch. And this also means that there is less interoperability amongst those DAOs. And so DAOstack, the vision was, let's create an infrastructure in order to facilitate the deployment of DAOs, which comes with a modular infrastructure. So you set up your DAO, and then you can choose the governance module, you can choose the economic module, you can create new modules and plug them, kind of like Lego or like, kind of WordPress. You create your website and you have like all those plugins, and then they become kind of standardized. And then you can really build a DAO in a few clicks in the same way as you can build a website in a few clicks. So that was like the original vision of like, we need to facilitate the way in which DAO can be created, but also we want to have some more standardized modules in order to facilitate the creation of DAOs and interoperability, intercommunication amongst them.
Primavera, explain a bit. I mean, not everyone in our podcast audience will know exactly what a DAO is. So can you describe what a DAO is for these newcomers into the space?
This is the hardest question, of course. Well, actually not. So I guess the DAO is a community, a group of actors that decides to organize themselves, mediated via a blockchain-based infrastructure. And the DAO is that particular blockchain-based infrastructure that facilitates the coordination and the management of resources of this community. So it's basically a smart contract that enable governance structure and treasury management, I would say.
Would it be correct to say that a DAO is like a cooperative built on blockchain?
I will say that some DAOs can take the form of a cooperative. I would like to argue that many DAOs do not take the form of a cooperative. Just like we have multiple legal entities which fulfill different functions, there is different designs for DAOs that also fulfill different functions depending on the governance needs.
Good. Well, and this gets you into a super interesting topic, which is DAO and governance. So, what are the main challenges of governing a DAO? And yeah, and then I can tell you my experience with that.
Okay, well, the challenge to govern a DAO are pretty much the same of the challenge to govern people. It's difficult to coordinate, right? So the challenge with the DAO, I think, is one, the blockchain is a pseudonymous system, meaning that unless you want to identify every user of the DAO, you have to cope with the fact that you don't know who is who from the members of the DAO. And that means that the usual model of cooperative, namely of like one person, one vote, clearly doesn't work. And therefore, we need to identify alternative mechanisms. So either we need to have a proof of personhood system in order to be able to recreate one person, one vote, more like democratic type of system. We need to identify alternative governance structures. Today in the DAO space, it's oftentimes either token-based, so the more token you have, the more influence you have, meaning that it doesn't matter if you're splitting your identity into multiple accounts. What counts is how many tokens do you hold. Then there is also the more still token-based, but more like NFT type of governance, where it's not really about the amount of tokens that you get, which can be purchased on the market, because then that leads more to a plutocratic governance structure, but it's more about which NFTs, which credential do you hold, and those credentials will give a different degree of influence. There is also like the reputation type of governance, etc. So there are many ways to identify alternatives to the democratic model. Generally, this falls into plutocracy, meritocracy, and then there is also a lot of DAOs that actually implement a much more centralized model of governance, where you just have like a multisig and some administrator that are actually managing the DAO on behalf of the members, which only have like a signaling mechanism to vote. So basically, I would say the main challenge is how do we design the governance structure in order to avoid co-optation and centralization. And funnily enough, using those multi-sig type of solution is actually more protective, because at least you know who is in charge. When you have a pure token-based system, then it's actually very easy to be co-opted by just powerful or by the richest actor that can actually purchase more tokens, and therefore end up also in a centralized system. So I would say the main challenge is if the goal of the DAO is to actually have a distributed governance, how do we ensure distribution of governance, and how do we ensure that the oligopolistic tendencies are not kicking in and from the backstage actually turning a decentralized governance into actually a highly centralized one.
And I mean, what would you say to the argument that some people make? I was discussing this type of topics with Eric Alston quite recently, So yes, you could have a governance done by one person, one vote, but the one token, one vote model makes sure that there is more like skin in the game for people who are making the decisions, right? And in the end, people who are not happy with that governance model, they can always exit the community, as this is a digital community and it's quite cheap or almost no cost at all to go to a different community. It's not like leaving a country or anything. What would you say to this model?
Yeah, I'm actually very I'm very skeptical of the argument about exit, because exit is an amazing system in, for instance, in open source, where indeed you can just cut and paste, and then you have an exactly identical system that then you can move into a different direction or govern in a different way. But there is still interoperability amongst those two systems. The problem when we talk about a blockchain is that exits are actually not cheap. If I'm part of the Bitcoin network and I'm not happy about the way in which Bitcoin is going, of course I can fork Bitcoin, but what is the value of this new coin? It's pretty much zero. So there is actually, because of network effects and because of economic value of the token associated with the blockchain, forking is not always costless. In fact, if I fork, I need to be sure that everyone is following my chain. Otherwise, I'm losing a lot of value by just exiting. Like the forked Bitcoins, Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin are not the same value. So sure, I can cut and paste and create millions of Bitcoin networks, but the economic value associated with them, and not just the economic value, how many users, like the whole point of a network is the network effect. The value of Bitcoin is that I can send Bitcoins to people all around the world because there are users on this network. If I fork Bitcoin and we're just like 5 nodes and 10 users, I don't know about the value of this. So basically, I think the argument of exit is not as strong when we are talking about a blockchain network with very strong network effects and economic value associated with the tokens, rather than when we're talking more traditionally of forking an open source software.
Okay, so I know that you have been following, a bit the different dramas that happened in the DAO ecosystem. So one of them I know more closely, is proof of humanity. But there are lots of other, situations of conflict within DAOs. Another that comes to mind now is the Maker Foundation and the decentralization process. Why do you think we are seeing so many DAO attempts ending in situations of conflict and high drama?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to distributed governance, which is when you have like an open system where basically tokens determines who gets to decide what and what is the influence of each, it becomes difficult to ensure that the value system is coherent and remains coherent over time. And this of course creates conflict, because on the one hand we do want the most open and decentralized and distributed governance structure, but at the same time those systems are very weak because there is no centralized entity that is protecting them, that is ensuring that they remain decentralized. Just like markets. Markets are great when they are pure and perfectly competitive market, but oftentimes there is like monopoly, oligopolies, etc. And so there needs to be some kind of intervention in order to ensure the decentralization. So I think on the one hand, there is the risk of re-centralization, maybe by actors that are not necessarily aligned, because oftentimes token holders are more interested in maximizing the value of the tokens as opposed to maximizing the usability, the usages of the DAOs. And in fact, the higher the value of a token, the less likely people want to spend them in order to interact with the DAOs. So there's kind of a misalignment of interest. And then in addition to that, there is even if the decentralization and the distribution is preserved, there is always the risk that different communities with different values end up having this kind of governance power over the DAO, and all of a sudden it becomes difficult to understand, like, or it becomes difficult to agree. And some people want to push in one direction, the other in another direction. And if there is no fundamental values and principle or direction that has been established and that can be preserved, as some kind of constitutional values, then it becomes difficult to proceed. It becomes difficult to trump into what should be the direction that the DAO takes, and I guess that's how a lot of drama comes about. Is for very good reasons. Different users have different interests, and of course they are all trying to further their own interest, and that might actually lead to a situation in which the DAO cannot operate anymore because there is not enough alignment.
You mentioned this word called constitutions, right? And can you expand a bit on that? I mean, what do you mean a DAO and a constitution? Constitutions are for countries, right, or also for DAOs?
Well, recently there are 4 DAOs as well, but yeah, basically, I mean, that it depends what we define a constitution. I will argue that every DAO has a constitution, which is enshrined into the smart contract that govern the DAO. Right? So that's a very strong constitutional rules that are immutably recorded on the blockchain, and that really dictates the way in which a DAO operates. So to me, it looks a lot like a formalized type of constitution, which is relying on code instead of relying on a piece of paper. And I guess that's the difference between countries relies on paper, DAOs relies on code. But I will argue that by definition, any DAOs that is deployed on a blockchain comes with its own constitutional framework, which is the code of the smart contract and the protocol of the underlying blockchain. And then the interesting thing that is happening in those recent months, years, is that so in traditional scholarship of constitutional theory, there is a distinction between the formal constitution, which is what has been written down, usually into a paper document, and then the material constitution, where the material constitution is actually what effectively is recognized as constitutional values and principles, even if they are not written down. And if we bring these into the blockchain space, I think we can create an analogy between the formal constitution being the on-chain code, the smart contract and the protocols, and the material constitution being more like those more off-chain mechanism, governance, structure, and value systems. And then, of course, there is also formal off-chain constitution. For instance, like in Ethereum, we have the Ethereum improvement proposals. Several DAOs have their own improvement proposal, which are formalized, but they are non-formalized on-chain. But then there is also this more fuzziness around this, which is, well, a lot of the governance mechanism, a lot of the norms, some of them are more or less entrenched and recognized as such by the community. They are material, but they are not formalized. And what we are seeing that is happening with a few blockchain networks or DAOs is this desire, I guess, this process of formalizing also those things that cannot easily be codified into code, into an on-chain infrastructure, and trying to link it, trying to figure out a way in which those principles can be recognized, can be documented, and also become binding on the way in which the DAO operates. And of course, this is a challenge because the blockchain only knows what's happening on chain. And yet there are things such as like, general principle, equity, also negative liberties. Those are all things that can hardly be codified into a code-based infrastructure, either because the computer language is too strict to actually even be able to be assimilated with those like larger and more flexible concepts, or is because code can pretty much just say like what can be done, but it cannot describe things of what cannot be done. This is really hard to codify negative liberty into a technical infrastructure, and I think those two motives are what I call this like blockchain constitutionalism 2.0, which is adding this new layer of constitutionalization on top of the existing formalized constitutional layer that is the on-chain codification.
So let's say I'm starting to build a DAO for my project, and at what point do I need to worry about the constitution? I mean, from the start, or first I would need to see if, there is product market fit? I mean, what is the right time to start doing this process?
Yeah, it's difficult because I don't think there is just one answer for all DAOs. I think it depends, right? I think like in some cases it's interesting to, for instance, like when you have like a group of founders that wants to establish a DAO, and if and only if there is a very strong desire to entrench specific values and principles and methodologies into this DAO, in order to ensure that as it evolves, as the governance of this DAO become more and more distributed, etc., there is nonetheless this safety valve mechanism that persists, so that you know that the DAO will evolve, because in some way, like at some point, you can no longer control and govern the DAO when it has become an actual decentralized entity, but you want to kind of maintain some type of directionality or constraints in the way in which it can evolve. And so in this case, it makes sense, I will say, to create some kind of constitution early on. Of course, you want this constitution to be legitimate as well. And this requires some kind of process that if it's like the founders that just like throw in a constitution before there is even an attempt of including or listening to the members of the DAO, then it's a problem as well, right? So the challenge of the constitutionalization is that it provides legitimacy when it is well done, but in order to provide legitimacy, it needs to have been done in a legitimate manner. And therefore, there always needs to be like inclusion, participation, and ensuring that all the people that are affected by the constitution also have a say into how this constitution should be drafted, what is the substantive content of this constitution, and so forth. And that means like in some way, either you need to constantly revise it, but that's also the whole point of a constitution, is that it's very entrenched and you don't revise it often. So there is this very delicate point in which I think it's important since the beginning, perhaps, to identify specific values and then start a process of constitutionalization once there are enough members, enough users of the DAO that can also be involved into this process.
Can you describe a bit briefly what one of these processes look like? I mean, the steps to build a DAO constitution?
I mean, I don't think there is like one recipe that fits everyone. I really think it's not that different from how traditional constitution can be made, which is, you know, either you have, depending on when do you do it, of course, but either you have like a group of founders that propose something and then consultation and deliberation and really trying to make the existing values and norms and constitutional values of an existing community to emerge and to be reflected into the constitution. Or you can also try from like a very different approach, which is let's throw a DAO with a constitution predefined, and then whoever resonates with that will join, right? So in this case, it's more for like a top-down approach. Or you can have like a fully bottom-up approach, which is, well, let's create the DAO first, and then once there is a large amount of users, let's have them make proposals about what could be incorporated into the constitution and whatnot. So it really, I think it depends on why the constitution is being made. It depends on when. It depends on the constituency. Is there already a lot of divergences into the different values of the constituency? And in this case, you need a much more elaborate and inclusive participatory system in order to make sure that all those visions are reflected, that there is an actual political discussion and finding the right compromise, which is a very challenging process, but a very important one when the DAO already has multiple different interests in the members. So I don't think I feel comfortable to give the one recipe of how DAOs can constitutionalize. I think first of all there is the question of which DAOs, like I don't think every DAO need a constitution. Some might need it more than others, especially those DAOs that are less related to some very algorithmical or parametrical type of governance structure and more about things that are really into like social organizations and issues that are more challenging than just let's vote on changing the parameters of how much staking needs to be done, etc. So I think, first of all, I think it's important to identify as a DAO, do we want to constitutionalize? Do we need that? Is the on-chain constitution sufficient? Or are there additional needs, additional values that needs to be entrenched? And then is the question of when. When is the right time to do that? And again, this is something I think that needs to be analyzed on a case by case. I think there can be some best practices and guidelines that might be identified at some point. Right now, I think it's very early on because many DAOs are just starting to engage into this process. So I think right now we're more into this observation, description, and some kind of analysis, as opposed to coming up with a normative stance about what's the right way to do it and whether this needs to be done.
There is something that you said that I found very interesting, and it had like kind of a Darwinistic way of seeing this process. You know, like you said something like, you know, you make your constitution and then it attracts people. So could you say that the better constitutions will tend to attract, more people and would win in the Darwinistic competition game against other, competing DAOs that are trying to get those same users?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to the question of exit and legitimacy, right? Meaning that, so yes, it is true that a blockchain system can easily be forked and replicated. Yes, it is also true that it is not necessarily costless. The reason it is not costless is because of network effect. And so while it is it is cheap to cut and paste and to replicate a particular DAO or blockchain network, I need to be sure, in order to maintain the network effect and therefore the value of the network, that people are following me, that my fork is the dominant fork by a large, like not even like 51-49, but it needs to be like a big majority. And so so basically the issue of legitimacy becomes extremely important, because legitimacy is associated with loyalty, right? And so in a system in which exit is very expensive, then voice plays a very important role, because you need to allow people to speak up in order to express their agreement or disagreement, so that the governance actually evolve in a proper way. In a place in which exit is easy, then the cost of exit depends on the loyalty. And so interestingly enough, like in most traditional concept of constitutionalization, we're thinking about constitutionalization because there is an authority that has some kind of coercive capacity over the constituent, and therefore the legitimacy is important, and you create the constitution in order to ensure that specific rules and procedures are always respected. In a distributed polycentric type of system where there is no coercive power, somehow legitimacy is extremely important nonetheless, because of the loyalty that comes with it. And that's where constitutions can serve both purposes. Constitution can serve the purpose of justifying coercive powers, but in a place where there is no coercive powers, the constitution actually played the important role of ensuring that there is enough legitimacy so that we can keep loyalty into the system. And so in this case, to go back with the Darwinism, if there is a DAO that needs to fork because, I don't know, they realize like, no, there is no possible coherence anymore. And so forking becomes the more rational strategy. In this case, who will people follow? You know, will people just like split into two separate DAOs? That's a possibility if there is really a strong divergences. But also if a DAO decides to fork and creates a constitution that is much more aligned with the value system of the people, then they might be able to actually attract the majority of the users to this new DAO because it has more legitimacy, and therefore people would rather stay loyal to this one than to the previous one, right? And so in this case, because of loyalty and loyalty being so important in a polycentric system in which exit is possible, then legitimacy becomes a very fundamental value that needs to be fostered, and that's where the role of constitutions come about. It is not about constraining coercive power. It is about generating legitimacy in order to ensure a sufficient degree of loyalty into the system.
I have two more questions. One is, well, I kind of know the answer, but I would like the audience to know the answer. Would you recommend Balaji's book, Network State? Yes or no, and why?
Okay, I'm trying to find the relationship, but I would recommend it a lot because it is a very interesting thing to read in order to realize how terrible this is. So I will recommend it to the people that can endure the pain, but it's also very interesting to discover. You know, it's a very interesting approach, like very exit-based approach to governance, which I really don't resonate with. I would like that less people read it because I'm afraid that people might actually buy into that. At the same time, I think it's important to read it also to see how bad it is. And let's think of an alternative that is a little bit less bad.
What do you mean by exit-based approach?
So again, I think it's all this discussion that if we don't like a system, we can just exit from the system. So we discussed already how the problem with exiting a blockchain is that you can exit. No one is obliging you to stay, but you have a lot of economic value that you're going to lose if you exit the system. And so despite the possibility of exit, which might be easier to exit into a digital system than into a physical state, but despite the possibility of creating as many alternative systems, unless you get the network effect, you are at loss. In the case of states, it's a little bit more complex because what does cut and pasting a state means? There's a lot of infrastructure that you need to replicate, and so when you exit, you're actually losing everything that the state provides, and then you might create your new freshly instantiated state, but you also need to recreate everything. So it's actually very costly to exit a state because of the necessity to start from scratch and recreate a new state. And states do a lot of work that most of us don't really want to do. So, and the other thing is also, I think, exit-based governance usually comes with this kind of competing flavor, which is now I have a new system, and now I need to compete with the previous system, as you say, with the Darwinism, in order to attract users or citizens into my place. And so I'm competing with the previous systems by exiting the system. Whereas for me, it's much more interesting to think about interdependencies as opposed to exit. When you exit, you kill all the dependency. You might choose to interoperate in some way, but you're no longer dependent or interdependent. Whereas I think this is kind of like, especially when we think about physical spaces, this is kind of like very naive to believe that you can escape from any interdependencies. And I would rather focus on ways in which we can experiment with additional layers of sovereignty, which remains interdependent with each other and actually support each other, as opposed to exiting the system, fractionalizing governance in multiple places, which then would need to recreate their own governance, their own public infrastructure, everything. And then anyhow, the question of interstate governance remains. So you're just moving the problem outside between states instead of moving the problem inside of like politics, right? So you're moving from politics into geopolitics, but the problem remains the same. Like you didn't solve the problem of governance just by exiting.
Okay, one last question. So what books, reading materials or whatever would you recommend to people who want to start learning about DAOs, Constitution, and all these topics?
Well, so very selfishly, I will suggest Blockchain and the Law, first and foremost. This is an interesting book. It's 2018, and surprisingly, it's still a little bit, it's still relatively on point, I think, on the, at least on the point of DAOs and so forth, even though it probably needs to be updated at some point. I'm also currently in the process of drafting a book on blockchain governance specifically, which will be much more looking at those questions of governance and constitutionalization, legitimacy, and so forth. I think more in the not my own stuff. I think there is this book which is called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty by Hirschman, Albert Hirschman, which I think is really, really interesting because it does raise all those questions of, I think most of the time people assume that because we can exit, we don't need to worry about governance. And because of this Darwinistic approach, and I think it's very important to think about loyalty as something extremely important, especially in places which have network effect. So I will strongly suggest to read this book, even though it doesn't tackle DAOs and so forth, but it's quite a fascinating read, I think, that can apply and can bring a lot of insights to DAO governance.
I also do recommend that book. That's great to understand all of the things. And so yeah, and I also do recommend your book, Primavera. So you don't recommend your own stuff. I recommend Blockchain and the Law by Primavera Di Filippi and Aaron Wright as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Primavera, for being with us in this episode. This is Federico Ast. I'm president at the Cooperative Kleros, and this was a new episode of the Decentralized Justice Broadcast. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.